Beep boop beep boop beep. Welcome to Dear Watchers, an omniversal comic book podcast where we do a deep dive into the multiverse.
We are traveling with you on a very limited bandwidth through the stories and the worlds that make up an omniverse of fictional realities we all love. And your watchers on this journey are me, user Guido.
Sorry, I was buffering for a second. It's me, Rob.
And all of this will make sense as we get further along. And if you're of a certain age, if you're too young,
that's true.
None of this might make sense.
Well, before we get to this cyberspace, what's happening in our little section of the multiverse, Guido?
Our section of cyberspace.
Yeah.
Well, remember that we are everywhere on social media with just our archive on Twitter, X platform, but find us on Instagram, Threads, Blue Sky, Facebook. So we want to hear from you. You can even send us an email and find us on our website, dearwatchers.com, a great archive of all of our episodes and links to anyone who's been on our show and much, much more, as well as the opportunity to support us.
It's been fun seeing some people's end of the year wrap up, seeing our fans, our listeners listening to us.
Yes, being in top 5 podcasts. That's been great. Thank you to people posting those. I've had many a text fight with people when we're not close enough to the number 1 slot that there's a problem. But you know who you are. People who are good fans and people who are not good fans. But we appreciate all fans and all listeners. And we also appreciate our many podcast friends. And happy anniversary to Comic Book Couples Counseling Podcast on 5 years.
Wow.
5 incredible years of their show exploring relationships in comics, and with now countless interviews that Brad and Lisa do. So happy anniversary to them. Very excited. They released a really cool poster. And shortly after this episode is out, I think we're going to get their anniversary episode, which is Scott and Emma.
Oh, how fun.
Of today's subjects, the X-Men. So very exciting.
Well, if you are joining us for the first time, we have 3 parts of our journey through the multiverse today: origins of the story, exploring multiversity, and pondering possibilities. So thank you for joining us in today's trip through the World Wide Web.
And remember, if you're enter AOL keyword Dear Watchers to leave us a review wherever you're listening. Thanks for those 5-star reviews.
And with that, Dear Watchers, welcome to episode 122, and let's check out what's happening in the Omniverse with our travels to today's alternate universe.
All right, let me plug this in. All right, I think we've connected to the alternate universe.
Great. Well, today we boot up and suit up and then ask Jeeves the question, what if the X-Men were cyberpunk? AKA, what if the X-Men were in the Matrix?
We have so many references that I'm curious how many people will get, but I think most will get most. What a fun time the internet of the 90s was. But today we're on Earth 83124 in the Marvel Universe, which made its debut appearance in 2018, had 1 follow-up in 2019, and has not been seen again. And we are going to discuss both of those appearances of Earth 83124 in great detail. I have no idea where that Earth designation comes from. I bet there is some even nerdier, geekier, techier, hackerier person out there who maybe can tell us, because there's really cool stuff like the title of this issue is actually in binary code on the cover. And so there's lots of cool stuff. I don't know if 83124 has to do with that, but let's get on with it, because we are going to talk about this Earth lots today.
Yeah, and Guido, I heard in a chat room, so someone instant messaged me this that you are a big fan of the X-Men. So
Yeah,
Guido,
my aim away message is X-Men fan number one. Yeah.
so Guido, why do you love the X-Men so darn
We
much?
have talked about them a lot, so I figured we'd start with what we like about them because we've talked about them so much, and I think we've surely talked about what we liked. But a recap for
Mhm.
people who don't listen to every single episode, shame on you. But a recap nonetheless. I think what, and this issue really makes it clear, is it's there's so many elements. There's the soap opera elements, there's the
Mhm.
serialized storytelling elements, there's the experience of being different and oppressed, but having that difference be invisible, which is incredibly queer elements.
Mhm.
So there are so many aspects of it that I love. But what I think we talk about on the show constantly, the reason we have this show and the reason this what if can even function, which we'll get into, but is that it's a world. It's such a complex world. It's a world you can step in and out of. It's, as I imagine people who love Lord of the Rings, who love any fantasy, love about it, is it's a world that you can have create relationships with characters, and you can
Mhm.
feel emotional stakes, and you can imagine yourself in the world. You can imagine what could happen in the world. It's a the world building, I think, is what I'll highlight today as a lifelong X-Men fan that makes me just love the franchise so much. And even on our episode 2 episodes ago, when we talked about Kelsey Grammer and his recent appearance. I guess I won't spoil it, though it feels like it's been spoiled. But anyway, 2 episodes ago, for some reason, we talked about Beast and Kelsey Grammer and the Fox
So for
universe.
some strange reason, yeah.
And while I'm not, as I said on that, I'm not like a huge fan of the Fox universe. I loved it at the time. I now don't like it that much. But what is cool even in that is it's a world to step into. It's a world with all these characters where you almost want to see them. Even as someone who's not a fan of the Fox universe, like I'm like, hell yeah, give me Famke Janssen as Jean Grey. I'm really eager to see that. I'd even take a little Sophie Turner as Jean Grey. I don't mind. Like, it's just fun to have this world of characters and, again, emotional stakes. So that's something that keeps me loving X-Men for forever, for all the past and all the future yet to come. And I don't know, I guess you like the X-Men. Maybe you love them, but why do you like the X-Men?
Well, I think one of the reasons why they are so intriguing is their fallibility, not just as people, but also their power sets. Because when you think of like the DC characters, they're all powerful. A lot of people have talked about that. But even a lot of the Marvel characters, like Mr. Fantastic, cool powers. Spider-Man, like who wouldn't climb walls? It's super strong. But so many of the X-Men have these abilities that actually hinder them, like Cyclops, like he has to wear these glasses, or Beast, who are mutated, or even someone like
Rogue,
Rogue, of course, is like the biggest
the best
example, right?
example.
So I think that's just what makes them so interesting. Is so many other superheroes. They, with the some exceptions, of course, the Hulk and the Thing, and but so many superheroes. It's like, who wouldn't want those powers? Like that is just cool. And then when you look at the X-Men, it's like, wow, a lot of these characters, like you wouldn't really want their powers, even if you looked like a quote unquote normal person, you still might not be able to function, even if like telekinesis or telepathy, I should say, like would you really want that? Would you really want to hear everyone's thoughts all the time and controlling that? So I think that then moves into the soap opera aspect that you were saying, because it's not just their powers, then it's about how almost those powers manifest as incomplete people or damaged people. I think they go back and forth, the personalities and the powers in that way.
Well, and I think this is a bit of a tangent before we get started, but just to call back again to that 2 episodes ago MCU X-Men discussion we were having, I think the point you just made is a really cool path for the MCU to go down, because I don't think any of the other MCU characters fit that
No.
fit that archetype, fit what you're saying. They're all blessed, and some of them have challenges, or there's death, there's grief, there's trauma, there's all sorts of that, but there is no one who, because of who they are, the nature of their powers, that is what produces the conflict or the trauma. And so that is a great avenue for
Mhm.
us to see on
And
screen.
some of the characters, Tony Stark is a billionaire, and Thor is a god, and the Black Panthers are kings and queens, but the X-Men are orphans who live in a house that they don't even own, and and they're many of them have been abandoned by their parents. So yeah, these are not characters that are gifted or gifted by society in the way so many of the other MCU characters are. So I'd love to see that explored.
Yeah. Well,
But for
today we
now,
have an
let's
Earth that is so different from that, and we'll see if we think this can ever be adapted or should be.
yeah, so we're gonna stick in that free AOL disc that we got in the mail and dial up into our origins of the story.
Right now, on this very show, you're going to get the answer to all your questions. Our amazing story begins a few years ago.
So, as you mentioned already, Guido, we have covered X-Men on countless episodes. So go to dearwatchers.com and you will find, wow, over 40 episodes on What If, Age of Apocalypse, interviews with creators, and so much more about the X-Men, including the animated series, which we both grew up loving. So, all that being said, what are we going to explore for today's origin?
Well, we don't need to explore the X-Men anymore. So it is time to take the other piece of this world, which I know everyone is shocked to learn is about cyberspace and cyberpunk. And so let's spend a few minutes with our background on some of the clear influences on this comic, which are cyberpunk and things like
Mhm.
Matrix. There is one other property that I know neither of us are into that the creator actually cites as an influence, and I'll get into that when we get into the issue. So, what is your background with cyberpunk and things like Matrix?
Well, I grew up in the 90s, of course, so all these early internet references are right bringing me back. And The Matrix, that was such a big movie. I mean, I just remember 99, you had this everyone was excited for Star Wars Phantom Menace. That came out. It was like, not so excited for it. And then there was this movie that, no one had heard of by filmmakers. I was in middle school, so I didn't know. I had never seen Bound, of course, but at that point. And it was like, whoa, like The Matrix. I remember so distinctly people, and we were already in middle school, so this was kind of the end of like doing this, but I remember like people playing in the schoolyard pretending to be the characters from the Matrix.
Pretending to have bullet time going
Bullets are
somehow.
totally bullet time, and like jumping on the jungle gym and pretending to like fly there, and everyone and so many people then starting to wear the long leather jackets, which I also did have one of those. I remember getting the DVD, and we got surround sound system and that big shootout in the lobby. Everyone I put on, because nobody we knew had a DVD player yet, so we would just put that big lobby shootout for everyone. It's like, this is a DVD, and look at the sound and everything. Like, that was a movie I just watched so much, but I didn't really take in so many of the other things around it, like Equilibrium with Christian Bale and Tay Diggs. That was all those other things that were kind of these Matrix offshoots around that time. And I was never
I'll
really a big internet hacker kind of person.
No, I think you're a little too young for that. Even the movie that I'd say is even more seminal than The Matrix in my internet, uh, whatever pop culture internet storytelling is The Net with Sandra Bullock.
Oh, I don't
The
think I've ever
Net
seen The Net.
was, oh my god, we might be watching it after we record this episode then, because I don't even know if it's good, but I loved it in like 1995 or whenever it came out, because it was the first time I remember like the threat of the internet. And
Mhm.
it's not even a sci-fi movie at all, but it just had so much about like what this newfangled modern technology can be. Whereas The Matrix, of course, is a sci-fi story. I actually didn't see The Matrix until years later. Years
Oh,
later.
wow. I don't think I knew that.
Because I'm older than you, so I was already, The Matrix came out in 99. I was a senior in high school, so I was going to the movies, but I don't think the movies were my number one priority. And I remember then in college, like, it was, of course, the right time that people were obsessed with it, and it's just felt like one of those things where I came too late, and so everyone was so obsessed with it and deconstructing it and analyzing it that I was just like, I don't feel like I even need to engage it. Unlike you, I did see Bound, so I already loved the Wachowskis, but I was not so interested, and I saw it years later. For me, I think cyberpunk is a lot more the hacking stuff, which I did. I loved playing with my Commodore 64. I loved using MS-DOS. I loved, even, we'll get into this in the issue, but like doing a little bit of like that. You needed to know, everyone who used a computer at that point, prior to like Windows 95 probably, needed to know a little bit of code. You needed to know how to open an executable file. You needed to know like how to type certain things to create certain effects. And I loved all of that. I wish I still had this. I fantasize about this on 5.25 floppy disks, one of those big soft disks.
Yeah, see, I never had those.
Very few people probably even remember, who are younger than me. I used to keep a monochrome screen green in DOS. There was no Excel, at least I didn't have Excel at this point. I used to keep a running list of every single mutant in the Marvel universe. So every time I would read a comic and I would meet anyone, I would type their name, their powers, and the comic that they were in, so that I had this like running index of every single mutant that showed up in the Marvel universe. And I used to carry it from computer to computer with me as our family would get new computers in the 80s into the 90s. And then at some point, I don't know, I never transferred it to Excel and got rid of it. So yeah, I grew up in that culture. I was never into it very much. Like, I never dressed like I was in the Matrix.
I've seen some photos of you with like blue hair, though, or maybe that's more.
That was a different kind.
Yeah.
That was like a rave culture, which
okay.
totally
well,
overlaps
which is connected,
with
right?
cyberpunk and hacking stuff. Yeah, but anyway, so yeah, I'm never drawn to cyberpunk stories, though. Even recently, there was the video game Cyberpunk 2077, which had a controversial launch, but then ultimately got really good reviews once they worked some bugs out. And it doesn't interest me to play that. I think, like, I don't go revisit Blade Runner. That doesn't interest me. Blade Runner 2049 was really pretty, but I don't tend to be drawn to cyberpunk worlds of fantasy. And I don't think you are either.
No, I'm not really. I mean, definitely the story we're about to discuss, I was reminded of Caprica as well, but I was never really into that whole kind of artificial world like that. And I think there's it seems to have, to some extent, gone away. I think you see a little bit of seeds in it in things like even Black Mirror as well. But do you still have like cyberpunk, do you think, in kind of mainstream, or is it because it has a dated element to it now?
Well, again, that video game is only a few years old, so it still holds appeal. I don't know why there isn't a mainstream movie that feels like it does it very much right now. I really have no idea. I don't know if we've moved away from it, if we've aged out of it, or if it's such a huge part of our culture that it actually feels sort of
that could be
mundane to have a movie with it. It was novel for so long, and now, even though I think the vast majority of the world is not using things like virtual reality or engaging in the metaverse, I think everyone has a passing familiarity with it. And so storytelling in that might be less interesting, or maybe we're going to see it come back around again. I'm sure. Who knows?
Well, I think that's the thing. Like, back then, it was, you really had to be kind of in the club to know it. And now everyone, well, not everyone, but most people have a passing connect, like a lot of people have heard of the dark web, right? It's not like a thing that, oh, you had to really know about what it is, but because a lot of people, it's like, oh, it's covered on the news and things like that. So I think you're right. I think it's just so much part of our culture now that it's just integrated.
Yeah. So, all right. Well, that's our origin is in cyberpunk, and that's going to be really important for the story that we're about to visit.
Yes, so we are going to head to the deep, dark annals of the internet and mutantdom to explore some multiversity.
I am your guide through these vast new realities. Follow me and ponder the question, what if?
And today we are asking the question, what if the X-Men were cyberpunk? And this is from What If the X-Men? There is a "the" in there. The X-Men, Volume 1, Issue 1, from December 2018. There's no title, but I'm going to call it AKA .exe/men.
Well, there is a title in binary code, which is What If the X-Men were cyberpunk? And I don't know. Yeah, there's not a title on the pages. That's true. So again, this is Earth 83124. It is written by Brian Edward Hill, who is credited with the source code. It is penciled by Neil Edwards and Giannis Milono Giannis, who are credited with graphics. It is inked by Neil Edwards and Giannis Giannis. The colors are by Rochelle Rosenberg, who is credited with hex code. It is lettered by VC's Clayton Cowles, who's credited with system administrator. The cover is by Raza, who is credited with cov.jpg. And then, of course, it's edited by Chris Robinson, who is credited with malware detected. So fun, very fun credits page going on, because it is a monochrome green screen line by line DOS code going on with the C:\/ and all that kind of good stuff. So real quick, before we get into what happens on this Earth, the creator, Brian Edward Hill, is a comic book creator who did some work for Dynamite, brief Batman story, little bit of Marvel here and there, only one issue prior to this, then this one, and then a few other in the Black Panther side of the universe, and is a screenwriter too. So still goes back and forth for some intermittent comics and some TV scripts. And there was an interview with him around the time of this one shot. This was one of those years where there was an end of the year flurry of what ifs. This was one of 5 or 6 of them. They were not connected to each other. And in that interview, he talked about loving Ghost in the Shell. So that's the big influence on this that you and I are not very familiar with. It is a manga that then became an anime and countless other media and properties from 1989 onward. So Hill loved Ghost in the Shell, had done one story in a totally awesome Hulk one shot, and then pitched to his editor there, doing a section of the Marvel Universe inspired by Ghost in the Shell. And that's how we got this. And there's a few other tidbits from that interview, but I'll save them for as we start talking about what happens on this Earth.
I see he also worked on Witchblade and Ash vs. Evil Dead, 2 other characters we've covered on the podcast.
Yes, because he did a lot of work for Dynamite, which both of them were part of at some point. Well, not Witchblade, but I guess just Ash. So all right, let's hear about Earth 83124 for today's discussion. I think we'll give beats of the story because it's a very unique story. And so I think we need to walk our listeners through it as we start talking about it.
So we are introduced to a world that is interconnected by a neural network, think the Matrix. Some people discover that they have abilities within this virtual world via the XEXE gene.
Yeah, and I say it EXE. I can't say it EXE. The whole time we were reading it, it was EXE. And because you know what an EXE is?
No, I don't.
It's so funny. EXE is just what comes after a file name. It's a file type known as an executable. And it means it's a file type that can run can run itself once you open it. And so in any Windows platform through to today, you have a .exe as an executable file that you would open. So it's a program
There you
file.
go. Well, yeah, and so some of these people have basically versions of their X-Men abilities in this world, but only in the virtual world and not
Right.
in the real world.
And it seems like now this is all given to us in like a title recap page.
Mhm.
It's not real. There's not really, we've never seen this background, but it's making it
Yes.
as if this background exists. And it seems like the world, the real world is starting to sort of fall apart. People are neglecting it because everyone wants to enter into the cyberspace world, the virtual world, because it's where they can be entertained. And it's, as it says in this, it's been commodified at every level. And so
Mhm. And in that way, it's very Caprica, which if people don't know, Caprica was the prequel series to Battlestar Galactica, right?
yes, though it followed it. Yes.
Followed it, but in very much it's a world where people can kind of become who they want to be, and a lot of them have kind of a 50s gangster noir kind of thing, but you can create virtual weapons and a lot of it's been commodified. So it really reminded me of that so much that I was like, oh, that must have been an inspiration, I would think.
Yeah, I would think, because that is 10 years prior to this. So, all right, getting into the story though, we now start, and in the story, Cable's on the run, has the bodies of Magneto and Domino in his truck, and he's fighting tons of little robots that are creating like light projections as weapons, including projections of Magneto's head and projections of DZLR, Dazzler, and we don't know much else as to what's going on.
Yeah, very Mad Max kind of imagery.
And
in
Matrix,
that
totally the
way.
Matrix.
Matrix, yeah, totally.
It's especially the Matrix sequels. This is very
Yeah,
visually
the big
like
chase
those.
in the second
Uh-huh.
movie, definitely. Well, then we flash back to Xavier, who's giving Cable and Domino the mission of saving Magneto from being corrupted by the Nimrod virus while he is in cyberspace.
Yeah, and this is a cool, especially this issue is not was not did not follow the Krakoa era, even though it's a few
Mhm.
months after that started. It clearly could not have been inspired by that, I don't
Yeah.
think, based on how comic production works. So it's cool though that that is such a dynamic of the House of X. Powers of
Yeah.
10 is the threat of Nimrod, so it's a neat conclusion.
And similar in the fact that Magneto basically, instead of Krakoa, he's kind of living in cyberspace. Like he doesn't really leave cyberspace. And also, there's this element of him creating things that help humanity, which is also very Krakoa too, right?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, I agree. There are some pieces that do feel similar, but so we also learn in this flashback that Xavier can now manifest his EXE powers that in the real world, and that allows him to enter anyone else's neural interface without entering cyberspace. So essentially a telepathy, a way of explaining telepathy, but making it
Mhm.
cyberpunk. But this evolution that he has experienced means that he's now dying.
Yeah, and he's like lost a lot. He's lost the use of his legs because we see him in the
Yeah, so it
wheelchair.
explains why he's in a wheelchair
Mhm.
here, which is of course clever because it doesn't always make sense why he should be in a wheelchair in alternate Earths, but
Yeah.
makes
And then we
sense here.
see Magneto. We should say he's not ever called Magneto. He's Eric Lancashire here, but we see Magneto giving this kind of veiled threat in a TV commercial that if the anti-EXE gene Stryker Act is not repealed, a revolution may occur. So there's this very X-Men-esque anti-mutant, anti-XCE gene act that's out there that basically makes it illegal to use these powers within the cyber world, or the government can actually kill you.
Yeah, and at this point he's talking about wanting to find equilibrium
Mhm.
between the EXE identified and those of basic genetics. So that's all we know at that point about him. And we cut to Domino, who enters Magneto's cyberspace which is an illegal action in this world, ends up fighting Nimrod and finding Magneto, Eric, the child, only to discover that, in fact, Eric, Magneto, created Nimrod to keep Xavier preoccupied while he enacted his real plan.
Mm-hmm. And then that real plan really is to have everyone have the EXE gene, which is I don't really understand why this is a bad thing. I don't know if you want to get into this now, but I don't know why this is so bad that everyone kind of just gets this special powers gene, because he's basically just leveling the playing field and making it so that everyone has this, right?
Well,
So
that's
how
why I
bad?
think it fits. That's why I think it's a great plan for a Magneto character, because it potentially makes sense. But of course it's a bad plan. It's the equivalent of genetically modifying
I
every
guess
human
that's
being
yeah.
against their will. So it denies people freedom. It obviously does what the Magneto of 616 does, which is also create homo superiority, make it that the mutants, the EXEs, are the superior class. In this case, he would do that by making everyone an EXE, by making everyone a
Mhm.
mutant. So I think it is that's why I think it works as a plan so well here. So we then find Xavier appearing in Eric's interface because of his powers. They fight and he defeats him. And it turns out that in the real world, what this defeat means is that Xavier's body has died and his mind has taken over Magneto's body. We also discover that he has now banded together or created. I'm not totally clear on this at the end, but in cyberspace, he now has the X-Men. The X-Men pretty much as we know them: Beast, Cable, Domino, Psylocke, Cyclops, Wolverine, Rogue, and Jubilee. And it closes with Eric, who we now know is actually Charles's consciousness, calling for hope for all humans.
Mhm. And then, well, there's some really fun back matter in there, which are some official handbook pages for Jubilee and Rogue, because we don't really have them as real characters in there. So gives them backstory. Jubilee's very similar to her actual backstory, as far as I could understand. And
They
she can
both
kind
they both are.
Mhm.
Rogue's deviates a little more because in Rogue's she meets Cody, who of course is the person that she kisses and absorbs his consciousness in the 616. But in this one, Cody kind of takes on more of a Mystique role and has her using her powers for bad, and she starts absorbing. It's cool how they translated it for
Yeah.
her. She
'Cause-
can absorb data just by touching something.
Yes.
So she'll go to an ATM and absorb all the credit from it.
Mhm.
And she can just absorb files from companies like Roxxon and Oscorp. And
Yeah,
then
it was a cool
Jubilee,
way to integrate it. Yeah, because Jubilee is kind of the same powers that she normally has, but I like that they
well, except they explain
adapted
it
Rogue
in
there.
different terms, because what they say is she can manipulate pixels to create
Pixels.
light
Mhm.
pixels. And so it's just very clever transposition of these characters' powers. I sort of wish we actually had one of these pages for each of the X-Men.
Yeah, no, I know. I was like, wait, there's only 2 of these?
Yeah. So what do you think of this?
I thought it was a lot of fun. I I definitely think it benefits from kind of knowing of that the Matrix and of that time period. I guess I had a little bit of a question of like why, other than maybe the only answer is that it's fun to do. But what
Well, and
what
Brian
do you
Edward
think?
Hill in the interview says it's clear that he is trying to use this as like a backdoor pilot, essentially, in TV
Okay.
terms. He talks a lot about the world he's created. He has a whole story with Psylocke and Dazzler because he loves both of those characters. He said it's like Blade Runner scale world that he's built in order to just write this one issue, and that he hopes to return to it. So while there is one brief return that we'll talk about in our next segment, it's clear that never happened or has not happened yet. This was 4 years ago. So yeah, I think this was meant to be the opening up of a whole world of
Mhm.
Marvel that you could do.
Yeah,
So
it
that's
is
part
it
of
is it
why,
is
that's part of the answer to why, I think, in terms of why this issue exists.
Yeah, no, it is fun in that way, and I definitely think you could do non-X characters in that regard. But what did you think as our ultimate X fan?
I did not like it at all when I read it in 2019 when it came out. I liked it a lot more reading it for this conversation. I think it is sort of just a blip of a story.
Mhm.
It feels really short, really, really short, even though it's a full issue. I don't know why. Maybe because of the art. It goes between two art styles for people who
It does,
haven't
yeah.
read it. One art style that's meant to look a little bit like manga Ghost in the Shell, and that's the art
Mhm.
style that's in cyberspace. And then there's the art outside of it. So I think they probably wanted it to be quite visual. And so the story just goes very fast. And so I didn't feel like there was a lot here that interested me the first time I read it. And I found a little bit more of it interesting this time around, just in terms of how he's taken the world of X-Men and totally transformed it, but in a way that feels so familiar. That is
Mhm.
exactly X-Men. So this idea that they don't have mutant powers, they have this ability in cyberspace, and so it's really high concept, interesting stuff that I think works pretty well. But in terms of an issue, the issue itself is less satisfying because it doesn't feel full enough.
Yeah, I could see them doing some Age of Apocalypse kind of world building where you see some of the other characters and who's Emma Frost in this world or something like that. Or it feels like they should be going to like a nightclub somewhere and encountering some of
Yeah,
these other
very Caprica.
characters.
Well,
Yeah, very
especially
much in that
though, because
way. Yeah.
it's given us the information that the world indulges in cyberspace because it's this commodified entertainment place, and we actually don't get to see any of that. So yeah, that does have potential too.
Mhm. I do think he does a great job, though, of distilling the Magneto Xavier conflict. And I guess going back to Magneto's plan, whether you agree with it or not, or whatever it is, I think he does a great job there. I love this line where he says, uh, um, "This is the only." Magneto says, "This is the only way to peace. I don't need you to have the strength to do it. Just have the strength to let me do it." Which he says to Charles, and I think like, oh, that to me is so key to the Charles Magneto relationship. It's like, Charles, you don't have to do it, but you just can't. Don't stop me from doing it like that.
Yeah,
And
and that I mean,
I think
I feel
that's
like I can hear Ian McKellen saying that, like, just stay out of my
mhm.
way. That
Yeah,
is
exactly.
always.
Like, yeah. It's like, yeah. So I think that is really well done in that way. And I actually did not see coming that Charles would basically take over Eric's body now that Charles's body is dying. I think that's a clever way of of wrapping up the story.
Well, and it fits well too with what we know about Charles, especially in more modern comics, which this follows, where he makes some bad decisions, some dark decisions. He's not actually as moral as our hero leaders tend to be, or we thought they were in the Silver Age. And so this is one of those. Like he essentially becomes the virus and
Mhm.
takes over Magneto's body, potentially, probably killing Magneto. We don't know for sure, but either way, it's an act of aggression, and so it is. Yeah, it is morally complex. I think that's the cool thing about this whole issue. It has a lot of moral complexity and philosophy behind it, just like something like The Matrix. It's clear that Brian Edward Hill had a lot he would want to say with this world. He even in an interview talks about, and this reference has become very different 4 years later, but that Magneto is a little bit like Elon Musk or Carnegie or Edison, like these men who transform the world with technology. And
Mhm.
uh, it's interesting to imagine what Hill would have done if given the chance to go further into the world.
Yeah, and I think it kind of goes back to what we were talking about at the top, where I was saying, well, you wouldn't not necessarily want to have the X-Men's powers, but I think this does pose an interesting philosophical question of like, what if you could have those powers, but only part of the time? And then when you didn't want to have those powers, you could unplug and exist in the real world. That is an interesting question in general, and it's something that I guess in some ways we're seeing now with people living their lives online, where you can be anyone you want in a way on social media or in the metaverse, but then you can
Yeah,
also
although
pull
I think
yourself
there's
out of there.
what was interesting reading this to me, and I was trying to think if this is part of why cyberpunk has never appealed to me very much. Not that I was like ahead of the curve or something in its lack of appeal to me, but like the metaverse hasn't taken off.
Mhm.
Second Life, when as big as Second Life was for a minute, it didn't sustain itself. Like there's something about this sci-fi trope that I think misses the fact that I don't imagine human beings will ever let go of the physical. I just don't think that will be true. The Matrix works because the Matrix, it's oppression. There is a system of
You
oppression
don't even
that's been
know about it.
constructed.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. Things, Caprica, I think, works too because it's in such small bits. So there are these small ways people go to the nightclub, people go to the casino, they do this stuff to escape reality. That seems a little more feasible to me, but I never imagine people just removing themselves from real world to live in the virtual
Mhm.
world. Now, your comparison though to social media, at this point, most people are living themselves mediated by technology, and I think that's interesting. And maybe if Brian Edward Hill could return to this world, he could explore a little bit more in ways that felt analogous or felt like they were saying something about that aspect of our worlds.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, usually I think it also in something like The Matrix, and we get a little bit of it here, and I think we'll get actually a bit more of it in our next story. The real world also has to be bad. Like in the Matrix,
Yes.
the real world doesn't even really exist anymore. People are living in like caves. So I think like of course then some people would want to live in a fake reality. Like for us right now, it's like it's the real world might be still better. We'll just need to give it a few years with global warming, and then everyone will want to live in the virtual world.
We're getting there pretty quick.
Uh-huh.
So Brian Edward Hill doesn't revisit this Earth, but somebody else does, and there's one revisit of it about a year later. So
Okay, well, let's clear our cookies and head into pondering possibilities.
Will the future you describe be averted, averted, averted?
So, Guido, what are we talking about for our pondering possibilities?
So, like I said, it's about exactly 1 year later. A different creative team entirely sets a short story in an anthology in this Earth, apparently. It doesn't have to be in this Earth. It is according to Marvel, and it makes sense that it is, but there's no threads picked up from Hill's story. So let's dive right into it.
Well, I'm going to look up the title on Alta Vista, and it is telling me it is Marvel Comics Presents Volume 3, Issue number 9 from November 2019. And it's this backup story in the issue, and this story is called Weapon _ EXE. Weapon X.
There's so many things with that in the first issue we didn't even really talk about, but especially in this issue where there's like lots of like U/, which is user, of course, and
Totally.
so there's lots of like that sort of terminology, and so they're having lots of fun. This is written by Zach Thompson and Lonnie Nadler, who've written at this point Age of X-Men and have written some X-Men stories, but are best known for, and still to this day, for independent and usually horror oriented or body
Mhm.
horror comics. They did a great body horror comic in Cable, actually. It's penciled by Andre Lima Araujo, who is also at this point known for, I'd say, Righteous Thirst for Vengeance, which is a great book. It's colored by Chris O'Halloran, lettered by Joe Caramagna, edited by Chris Robinson. So same editor as the last issue, though it is no one else from that creative team. And a real quick summary, this one is brief, so I'll just summarize it before we get into it. In this revisit to the world, the Wolverine we meet, who is the cursing best at what he does. I like that it's like, you know, it has like the cursed out hashtag
Yeah.
question mark, etc.
Which we get a lot from Cable in the first issue as well.
Yes. Is actually user / Wolverine, who is in cyberspace fighting against corrupt users known as the Clan Yoshida in cyberspace. And in reality, it's actually Abraham Cornelius, who in the 616 is the Weapon X doctor. So it's not even Logan. It's not the Wolverine that we know. And so Beast has developed a way that he can just go in and out of the cyberspace world. And so he goes in to fight these corrupt users, ends up fighting the Silver Samurai, this massive multi-armed beast,
like a kaiju kind of. Yeah,
defeats him in cyberspace.
Goro, right?
And then finds in the real world that there are a bunch of users who are hooked up to one interface to create the Silver Samurai. So he disconnects them all and kills them in a very like Matrix or even Eon Flux looking sequence.
They reminded me of like the precogs as well from Minority Report also.
Yeah, I feel like there's so many references in sci-fi stuff. So it's a fun little bit of a side story. Again, it doesn't move the narrative of this Earth forward in any way at all, but it's fun.
But I actually think it tells you, because we actually spend a lot more time in the real world really than we do in the What If issue. I think it actually gives you a lot more background on to what the quote unquote real world is like at this point. And I think it makes more sense why people are in the virtual world, because it's definitely got that very everything's shanty towns, and then there's clubs, and you could definitely hear the techno music playing and that kind of thing. So I think it makes sense. Oh, okay, the world has kind of fallen apart, so people are living in this virtual world, which is a lot cleaner looking. The colors are so much brighter.
Yeah, it's very much a post-apocalyptic type thing.
But it kind of makes sense post-apocalyptic. It's not like it's not totally Mad Max, right? It's like, it's like the first Mad Max movie. Like, it hasn't quite fully gone over the ledge yet.
Right. Society has crumbled, but it's not yet reshaped.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's fun. I mean, the art is awesome. The battle with Silver Samurai is gory and really fun. I enjoyed that a lot. And I like what's sort of a subtle little twist with the fact that there are these 9 people who are making the Silver Samurai in the real world that then he has to kill, because it seems like he's like this weak doctor on the run who just in cyberspace keeps destroying the corrupt users. And then he ends up having to kill 9 people in the real world because they're in there creating all these corrupt users. So
and I'm only now realizing, that's why the Silver Samurai has all those multiple arms, is because it's all the different users that are controlling him. And the art too for the real world stuff, actually the art for the whole thing I actually really like. I like it a bit more than the What If issue, because in the reality it's super bright colors, and there's a lot of cool stuff. Like we see like buildings that are upside down and like floating. And then in the real world though, like Abraham Cornelius is like super withered. It almost feels like he's been destroyed by probably being plugged in all the time, and he's not eating or getting, and like he looks he looks very distorted. So it gives me that kind of body horror thing that you mentioned. Well, that's why the writers
reminds me of Eon Flux, like I said too. It has that
totally
grotesque feeling to it. Yeah. So it's fun. It's worth seeing. Do you want more of this world beyond this?
I think it is a very interesting. Actually, I not so much after just reading the What If, but I think actually reading this and seeing, this would be an interesting way of them exploring this world. I think it would be interesting, and I think it would be neat to go beyond just the X-Men and go into other Marvel characters and see how you can explore. I think it would be interesting to see a character that looks totally different, like deformed in a way that, say Nightcrawler or something, like see, oh, what if someone like you look like Nightcrawler in the virtual world and you look like a regular human in the real world, and like that, explore that dichotomy.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's a lot of potential in it. I'm curious if maybe there were even plans in place, and of course this follow up is only a few months before publication stops and COVID sort of totally shifts and redirects the whole comic book industry. So
Why do you
there's
think
a
all of
chance we'll
this
see it
though
again.
came so long after the Matrix and other things? Do you think this is nostalgia of these writers of a certain age, or now
Well, I
bringing this
wouldn't.
in?
Yeah, nostalgia, but in the best way possible, where it's just
Mhm.
inspiration. It's
Sure.
just
Yeah.
it's just a setting and a trope, if you will, that lives inside some people's minds now as a point of reference. And so why not take that and apply it to something,
Mhm.
which is what if is really good for. I mean,
Yeah.
it's genre blending, which what if doesn't always do, but some what ifs, and I feel like more Elseworlds do genre blending than what ifs,
Yes.
where they're taking like Batman and dropping him in a western and making him a
But yeah,
cowboy,
Batman
or
seems. I right away, as soon as you said genre blending, my mind went right to Batman, where it's like he's fighting Jack the Ripper, or he's with the Phantom of the Opera, things that we've talked about even on the podcast. Like that is a character, you just put him in all these different places. Maybe because, do you think it's because the Marvel characters exist, quote unquote, on our Earth, that
I do
they're
think that's
less?
part of it. Yeah, because if you look back at all of the what if stories, even if they take place in a totally divergent universe, the universe usually looks like a universe we are familiar with. And DC, it feels like over the course of Elseworlds from the 90s onward, didn't feel that same need to have it look like the comic book universe you were familiar with. It was fine with them that it looked like something completely different. And there are exceptions over the course of What If, especially the later second volume stuff. Like when we get into the horror segment of that, we read the Mystique and Rogue one, where it's like the very, very horror sketchy drawing, and it's like
Mhm.
based on flowers in the attic.
Yes.
So they
Yes.
play with genre a little bit more toward the end of the second volume, but they still don't do a lot of issues where they're just really picking up a concept and dropping it into a completely different world, which is
Mhm.
what Brian Edward Hill is doing here. He's taking
Mhm.
X-Men and setting it in the Matrix.
And I'm thinking too, there was a lot of other stuff. I mean, I mentioned Black Mirror before, but I think the TV show Alex Garland's Devs was around this, which also kind of touches on some of this
Well,
similar
that was after,
thought.
because that was
Oh,
after the pandemic. We
oh, that
were
was after the
watching Devs.
pandemic. Well, I
Yeah.
do think though that there was something, again, like just maybe in the zeitgeist at the time, maybe because people were thinking that the metaverse was going to become a bigger thing than it has, and they wanted to make sure they explored it.
Yeah. I bet more of these stories exist all the time, just not in places where we're looking. I mean,
Mhm.
certainly if you look at manga,
Sure.
there's cyberpunk all the time. It's a whole genre of it, and it's constantly going. And I don't know where it is in terms of popularity compared to some of the other genres of manga and anime, but it definitely exists. So I think
Yeah.
it just doesn't show up in mainstream Hollywood or mainstream comics publishing all that often.
Mhm. I'm sure there's somewhere out there a cyberpunk versus steampunk comic or
I'm
or
sure there's
something.
countless iterations of exactly
I'm
that.
gonna run you over with my locomotive versus I'm gonna enter the dark web.
I'm sure it exists, and I'm not interested, but
No, it's gonna
good
be
for
like techno
those of you who
techno
are.
music with like a flute or something like
Yeah,
that.
or is it a calliope? Not a calliope. Yeah,
Yeah,
what is
calliope.
the
No,
thing?
definitely.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
All right. Well, that's enough. That's enough. I see that we've spent $973 on our phone bill to dial into the internet to record
I know,
this episode.
And your sister needs to make a phone call.
Yeah, we had 2 lines pretty early on.
Ooh,
specifically
la-di-da.
to prevent this. But sometimes people would mistakenly pick up the phone and then that disconnected you. And so, I think that's about to happen. That's a wrap. Dear watchers, thank you for listening. I have been your user, Guido.
And I have been fully buffered, Rob.
And our reading list is in the show notes. You can follow us on social media at Dear Watchers.
Leave
We're
us a
not
5-star
active on X.
No pun, not coincidentally. And leave a 5-star review wherever you listen to podcasts. We'll be back soon with another trip through the multiverse.
In the meantime, in the words of Watu, keep pondering the possibilities.